Good afternoon. Now the Hero is part of Swansea's 14 to 18 now commemorations of the Great War centenary. We are absolutely delighted to be welcoming this preview to Hay today. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Marc Rees, Owen Shears, Owen Griffiths, Owen Morgan Roberts, lots of Owens, and Jasper Rees. Thanks so much.
We're like a scrum, aren't we? Is that sound my iPad? I hope not. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is an unusual event for the Hay Festival. It's a discussion devoted to a forthcoming theatre piece, but it's not just any theatre piece, and it's certainly not just theatre, in fact. Nawr Arwr, is that correct pronunciation?
Yep.
Good. Now the Hero is part of the Great War commemoration 1418 now. It's what Wagner might describe as a, this is not a word I use all the time, by the way, a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art. It involves theatre, it involves choral music, visual art, performance art, and poetry and horticulture. In the course of this hour, we will talk about Now the Hour in detail, and also touch on the wider careers of the collaborating artists. And they've already been introduced to you, but just so you know who's who, from the left is Owen Roberts, Owen Griffiths, Marc Rees, Owen Shears, and my name's Jasper Rees. So that's 3 Owens and 2 Reeses. And I've always thought that your name is just an anagram of Rees.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's aspiring to sound like the 1970 Welsh backline, really.
Did you not get the memo about the cap?
No, I didn't. No, and obviously you didn't either.
As you pointed out, you've got hair, we haven't got hair.
I actually thought that I'd driven too far and I was actually in Builth Wells, but there we are.
Right.
You can take it off now. Yeah.
That's enough banter. For my preparation for chairing this event, I was invited by Marc to Swansea to have a look at the venue for Now the Hero. So we started off on the beach in Swansea Bay, and then we went into the magnificent, very beautiful Guildhall. And Marc talked me through what audiences will be seeing in September, and by the end I was saying, how long do I have to queue to get a ticket, because it just did sound spectacular. Marc, could we start by you just telling us what we're looking at behind here, and could you fill in with a brief outline, very small digested version of what you told me?
I shall try and keep it brief. In the background you can see images, details of the Frank Brangwyn panels themselves. We also had a launch, because the theatre event is an immersive experience, and we interweave 3 narratives of war. We have the Celtic period, the Great War, and contemporary conflict. So you have 3 soldiers representing each period. You also have the counterpoint, which is played by the wonderful Eddie Ladd. She's the peace protester. You see her. And also you have then shots of graft, which is a garden, which is led by Owen Griffiths. He'll speak more about that. And that's the construction work that you see going on, and some planting. And also then you see images of us doing a recce, some with Owen and Owen Roberts, and with also the late Johan Johansson, which of course we're going to touch upon today. So that just is kind of like showing the kind of mainly our kind of feels and what we're going to discuss today.
Could we start with the Brangwyn panels, Marc, because I think that was the lift-off point.
Yeah, it was the main inspiration. So 1489 came to me because they've been following my work, and they said, would you like to do something to commemorate World War I? And I was like, okay, that was quite a challenge. And I wanted to do it in Swansea because it's my hometown, and it's forever the bridesmaid to Cardiff's bride. So, and I remember going to the panels, visiting the Brangwyn to watch concerts, and being absolutely fascinated and drawn to this amazing kind of colourful world, this kind of perfect paradise that he portrays. There's lots of fruit and flesh on display, and they are extraordinary. There's 16 of them, and I kind of recall that it was something to do with World War I. That, behind this kind of fecundity is a kind of World War I memorial of great significance. So I thought that was a good way in, and also to do it and to celebrate these rather neglected panels. They have a fascinating history. They were commissioned by the House of Lords in 1928 as a commemoration of World War I. Brangwyn drew these kind of very kind of graphic, kind of very representational kind of scenes of the World War. One, too brutal apparently, and they were rejected. He then, almost kind of as a protest, kind of went absolutely the opposite and created this kind of paradise, perfect paradise, to represent the peoples and the produce of the empire that, of course, Britain called upon to kind of save Britain during World War I, and of course many of them died. So this is a commemoration to those people, because it's very easy to forget that during World War I, on the front line, I went to, with 1480 now, to the Somme, and you realize how multicultural the front line was, and it's very easy to forget that. So this, for me, really represents a multicultural world. And they were rejected, and then he did this incredible, over 7 years, painted these fantastic paintings. The House of Lords hated them because they're too colourful and lively, portrayed the natives in a too dignified manner, and it's all tits and bananas. That's exactly what they said. So, cities then bid for them. Swansea actually won this bid, ironically. So they won this bid to actually house the panels, and the Brangwyn Hall was being constructed, and they actually elevated the ceiling in order to accommodate the panels, and also because I think Brangwyn's parentage is Welsh, so that's why they bought them, and that's why they're there to this day. And that was my way into World War I, and I wanted to go way back in time, because in my work I like to collapse time, so I wanted to look at the Gododdin, which is written by Aneurin, which is 600 AD, is an extraordinary piece of work, and is still so relevant. I wanted Owen was the only person who I wanted to kind of create the libretto, to adapt it with a kind of rooting it in World War I, and also then I wanted a contemporary conflict, and that's represented by a contemporary soldier, serving soldier, called Captain David Williams, who will play himself throughout the piece.
Talking of panels, Mark, there's no getting away from the fact that we are a manel.
We are a manel.
5 of us. So could we just address the fact that this is not an entirely male piece?
No, I mean, actually, because the women's voice is extraordinarily important in this work. I mean, Eddie, she absolutely embodies all women, and she will be actually guiding. We have a thing called Curadrodd, which is group recitation. So there will be 100 women from the Swansea Valley of all ages who will recite 6 verses of the Gododdin. There are some people here in the front who are actually part of that chorus, and Eddie will guide that. So she will kind of be leading it, like conducting it, but physically, and also then Owen then has adapted some of that as the libretto. And I wanted Eddie to play the Peace Protester as the kind of counterpoint to the kind of depictions and the narratives of war that form the heart of the piece. But essentially, I think the piece is about healing, and the libretto on the sounds, we've talked a lot about that, because the panels represent regeneration, rejuvenation, and that's exactly what Owen's doing with his volunteers in Graft in the garden. So it's kind of a contemporary version of the panels.
Should we start with a Gododdin? Is that the best place to start? You have some. You're just going to read a small bit of it to give a flavour of 6th or 7th century Welsh, which is practically Brythonic, isn't it?
It is, and
almost pre-Welsh.
It is extremely, extremely difficult. I shall do my best. Gwir a aeth gatraeth gan wawr, trafodint a'i hedd a'i hofnawr, milcant a thrychant am daflawdd, gwiarllyd y gwynoddyd wawr. Ef gorsaf wriawr yng wriawr, rhag gorsgordd mynyddog mwyn fawr. Gwir a aeth gatraeth gan wawr, dy grymus a'i hoed a'i hynyanawr, medd yfynt, milyn milys maglawr, blwyddyn bu llewen llawer cerddawr, coch a'i cledda fawr, na phirawr, a'i llaen gwyn calch a thedriollt penawr, rhag gorsgodd mynyddog mwyn fawr.
How many... Are there any Welsh speakers out in the audience, I can't actually see, but those of you who are sticking your hands up, how many of you understood that?
Yeah.
Right, okay, certain words. Owen Shears, could we move on to your interpretation of Gododdin that Marc has just read out? What was your approach? How did you enter?
What was my approach? I guess it's a poem that I've always been aware of. It's almost ever since it was first written down, it's become a touchstone for poets and for writers, and specifically Welsh writers, as a poem of eulogy and elegy around conflict. And so it's probably most famously known as being an important point of a reference for David Jones in his fantastic First World War work, in parenthesis. And then more recently, a poet such as Tony Conran, when writing an elegy for the Welsh dead in the Falkland Isles, he opens with that line, 300 men went to Caertraeth. So I'd always known about the poem, and I very much used it as a touchstone myself, actually, when I was writing about the Afghan conflict in a work called Pink Mist. So I was thrilled when Marc approached me, because I was aware of the history of the poem, how it was actually written up in Scotland. It's about a Gododdin whose capital was actually Edinburgh. But at the same time, I was daunted. I mean, I'm not a fluent Welsh speaker, doing Dysgu Cymraeg now. And as Marc said, it is old Welsh, and it's quite difficult even if you are a fluent Welsh speaker. But having talked about it, the way that we wanted to work was essentially Marc sent me, I think, 10 stanzas. And the form of the poem, I should say, is essentially a eulogy and an elegy for an individual warrior who is normally given some kind of a specific attribute. And it's beautiful, it's enigmatic, it's strange, but I knew that I wanted essentially to create a version. So I've called this a gleaning, as a way of referencing, I suppose, a gathering from a field that has already been harvested many times, but also obviously to reference the gleaning of the young men, and the fact that, again, the young men are harvested many times, again and again in conflict. I asked my mother to lend me my grandfather's Welsh dictionary, and I poured through these 10 stanzas, trying to find those points of a comparison between the Old Welsh and the New Welsh. And so I can't pretend that I understood all of the Welsh, but I found enough purchase to sort of give me those springboards, really. And in terms of the writing itself, I wanted to acknowledge that 6th century Genesis, but I wanted it as where possible to reference the Welsh in World War I, specifically the part that the Welsh took in the Battle of the Somme. And I guess I partly wanted to do that because I wanted the libretto to have a tension between the ancient and the early 20th century and now, and to feel both ancient and timeless, because I think that's partly why people keep going back to Gododdin. It is ancient, but it speaks tragically to what we're still doing. And in a similar way, I wanted to reference that myriad allusion and the assonance, the internal rhyme of the form, but in places to break it as well. I guess as a way of trying to embody the violence that the poem contains, quite often beautifully, but once you read it for what it is incredibly graphic, as well as being a celebration of failure. We should say it's about the 300 warriors who were handpicked, who were then feasted for a year and were given mead. And we think that they were probably also trained as well. It wasn't just drinking. Not the best way to prepare, but perhaps that's why when they went to attack the town of Caertraeth, it was an awful failure. So it is a strange poem, isn't it? Because it's a lamentation and a celebration and a eulogy and an elegy all in one.
With your permission, we're going to build up to your reading, which you're going to do later. I'd like to move on to Owen Roberts. Could we start talking about the words that Owen Shears has supplied? You and Johan Johansson, between you, have supplied the music. Could we begin, Owen, by talking about Johan Johansson?
Of course, yeah.
He is I've written down a phrase here which, I mean, you, Mark, asked him to, essentially, you went to him initially because you wanted him to write a requiem, and he'd never written a requiem before, and yet the American film director Aaron Moorhead said of one of his compositions, alas, prophetically, it's like he wrote his own requiem. Over to you, Owen.
Well, I mean, his music, yeah, I mean, what can you say? It is, it's timeless, and I mean, a lot of his film scores, his orchestral pieces, everything to me already had, death as a feature in it forever. I mean, I worked with him for about 6 years mostly as his sort of arranger assistant, but it was the relationship was quite an open, very close, creative relationship. He was a very open guy who would let you into his process and would bring your idea, would value your ideas. I was quite young and inexperienced when I started working for him, and he brought me in and trusted my instincts with his music, and gave me opportunities that I never had before. So I have a huge amount to thank him for in general. But yeah, having been to his funeral a few months ago, I can tell you his music is powerful funeral music for himself.
Let's spool back a bit, Mark, and could you tell us why you why you approached Jóhann Jóhannsson, who's an Icelandic composer who you encountered, I think, in Carnarvon.
In Carnarvon, yeah, an odd place to meet him, but he'd done the score to a kind of rather wild and crazy Icelandic choreographer, solo, and it was amazing, but the sound was particularly visceral, and it really kind of affected me. And we got on well, and I'd always wanted to work with him. In 2012, when I did the Cultural Olympiad, where I dragged an aeroplane across Wales, in Ebbw Vale, we worked with the choir, the male voice choir, and as former steelworkers, and I wanted him to do the music because he'd done this piece called Miners' Hymns, couldn't work together. And since then, of course, his career just went, twice Oscar nominated, and I thought he was perfect to do this. And the only way you could do it is then, that it would be a collaboration with Owen. Thank goodness that's what we agreed. But of course, Owen now will carry on without him. And from the conversations, the sketches that we've already, begun, nothing was written, but there's a lot of, his voice will be there, is already there.
And that's the challenge at this point in writing. So, I mean, I'm beginning in the writing process at the moment, but the main focus I have at the moment is balancing our voices. I know, like, having worked with him in the way that I worked with him, I kind of feel his voice is there in the decisions I'm making anyway, but for this project, since we had ideas and we had a plan, but we had no written material, it's about listening for his voice in every decision I'm making, which is a difficult experience emotionally, but yeah, I feel like I know what he would be saying in all the decisions I'm making, kind of. So it's.
And unfortunately, he and Owen came to Swansea to visit the Brangwyn, where I could take them on a tour of the whole experience, and he played the organ. So it's going to be for voice and organ, and that was a wonderful moment where he started to play kind of motifs which we recorded. So I think that would provide stimulus for the Requiem itself. And it will be sung by an extraordinary choir called Polyphony, led by the conductor Stephen Layton, who are the best choir in the world. And we had the privilege of having 3 of them in a session, and they were extraordinary. So I think, imagine having another 26, it would be incredible. And that was a wonderful moment to be in that room, to see Owen working, and also, having to confront his loss. But he was there. I mean, Jóhann was there, and it was really moving. So it was really touching.
Because I have bits of material that we were working on together around the same time that weren't necessarily for this piece or anything, but so for that recording session, we used one piece that we'd been just a piece of choir harmony that we hadn't really decided what it was for, but was just something we'd been throwing backwards and forwards. And that was the first thing we recorded in that session, and it was really the first music I'd addressed making since his death. It was very difficult to make music after he died because he was so connected to my musical life. And yeah, I mean, we looked at each other at the end, completely moved. He was there in the room, and the singers this is the thing I've been saying to people since that recording session, is we spent years looking for singers who sing like this choir do. Basically, we found the perfect Johann choir, the ones we were looking for the whole time. So,
could you? I mean, maybe this is a good opportunity to play that.
Yeah,
I think, especially with the choir, so people can hear.
Yeah.
Is this a raw?
I have a raw one that is just the choir unprocessed. If we have sound, I don't know how loud this is going to be. Let's see. So maybe I can talk over and explain. This is, you may have heard the first line, I think it was the first line of the section that you read, this Gwir a aedd getraif gan Nawr. I hope that was okay, pronunciation.
Perfect.
Which will be a key part of the choir material for the piece. We treated in this recording session each word individually, and then there was this take, which is the full sentence. What does the phrase mean again?
It means a men went to Getraif at dawn.
And it goes on for a while. But this is the piece I was talking about. This is the one we were exchanging before he died that we used for that session. And maybe it's just worth explaining musically. For the piece, there will be more electronic material or tape material, because Johann was, if anyone ever saw any performances of his, he was very keen on these old Revox tape loop machines, tape reel machines. So we've been using those to compose with. We'll also be using them to surround the choir and the organ in a bit of a kind of more drone electronic landscape, which is, was a key thing in Johann's music, always also in mine a lot of the time, having a center of acoustic, more beautiful material surrounded by more experimental electronic textures, which the point being, I think, and the reason I imagine you wanted Johann for this in the first place is he did, and what I will try and do for this, he did the connection between beauty, order, and chaos really better than most, and that's crucial for the themes in this piece, absolutely, and the timelessness as well, I think.
We've barely scratched the surface of what those of you who come to this will actually see, but one thing. When I went to Swansea, my first port of call was the National Waterfront Museum, where I met Owen Griffiths. And he introduced me to a long row of raised beds in which vegetables were being grown. Could you explain, Owen, what connection the vegetables have to the growth project has to the Brangwyn panels and to now the hero?
Yeah, so I'm growing the spuds for this. And, basically, where Marc asked me to, I'm an artist, I work with communities around land use, around food justice and reconnection. And what we're doing in this project is building a kind of green infrastructure and a socially engaged artwork, a project where people's expertise and knowledge and all the things that are dormant in crowds of people come out. So this what we're trying to do is create a kind of space where we can actually talk about, not through the growing of the vegetables and growing other things, how can we talk about where do we want to live, how do we want to live. So in essence, it's kind of a radical piece of land inside the museum. So it's in the courtyard of the National Waterfront Museum. And inspired by the panels, we talked about this idea of like how we could build a kind of utopian garden and how we could kind of create this sustainable project as a legacy thread to Now the Hero. So Now the Hero is a sort of time-based project. It will end in September, and what we're trying to do with the garden project is extend that sense of the of the themes of the piece, and this idea of like how can we create a piece of useful art out of this. So as much as we need useless art or beautiful art, it's quite nice to have something which is kind of a useful tool which will kind of continue to develop beyond the life of the project. So there's a series of raised beds that go through the Waterfront Museum. You can come and see it. We're here every Friday, 10 till 3, so come and dig or move. We've got 10 tons of topsoil coming this Friday, so you're welcome to come along. We've got a group of about 30 volunteers who come regularly, and we work with a school group. And sort of my interest is in edible landscapes and the idea of like how these edible landscapes in urban centres can be radical spaces or can be spaces for other types of conversations. So Swansea is a city which desperately needs as much help as it can get on the urban planning conversation. It's pretty disastrous. What we need is to talk about how green infrastructure could lead the way that the city develops, how we could talk about edible landscapes as civic landscapes and as political spaces. So how can we create more arenas for these kinds of conversations? So this is what's sort of underlying this work, is how we could create a new resource for the Waterfront Museum. And it's called Graft because it's a grafting of a garden onto a museum. And then we can also use the garden as a tool to talk about the collection. We can talk about our colonial history. We can talk about activating the collection in different ways. We can use it as an edible schoolyard. There's an amazing network of edible schoolyards across the States. We've probably heard of them, developed by Alice Waters. And for me, this is about, like, I've been visiting these places in California, in different places through my role as creative ambassador, and I'm trying to bring some of this knowledge back to Wales. And luckily, Marc keeps asking me to do projects, so that's brilliant. And we can then use that, leverage that kind of massive, beautiful artwork that you're creating to create something local and sustainable, which is literally about how we can have conversations around peace, how we can do all these kinds of things. But the garden is the context for this stuff. So through the making of things like we've got a whole thread, a curriculum around the garden, which we'll be weaving baskets, we'll be learning how to carve spoons and ladles so we can serve the soup, which I haven't mentioned.
No. I think also, for me, it was really important that Owen identified the indigenous vegetables featured in the panels and grow them, and we would harvest them and we would serve the audience as soup, because for me it was really important that the audience would actually ingest the panels and then contemplate what the panels symbolise at the very end of the performance. And that for me is a really key
I forgot to mention that. We're making a soup for 2,500 people.
It'd be a very simple soup.
Yeah, but again, if you want to come to that and help peel potatoes, that would be great. So there's a lot of work to do around that, but we'll be feeding 500 people a night with some of the produce from the garden and some of the produce from our community agriculture partner, which is a fantastic project in the Gower called Kaitan, the community supported agriculture project. So it's about bringing all these kinds of things and bringing this dialogue and this kind of agricultural dialogue into the centre of the city to talk about how this stuff can be visible, political, and about culture and about climate change as well, about all these kinds of connected points. So the garden is a meeting point, and it's about challenging how the museum talk about education. It's about giving them a new resource, but it's also saying to them, how does this connect to the Future of Wellbeing Generations Act? All these kinds of political things that are kind of fed down from Welsh Assembly government in different ways for communities to be more sustainable or more connected to land. They still need kind of communicative tools. They still need artworks or projects or images to kind of get into that. So this is an attempt at creating kind of meeting space for all those things, really.
Marc, you mentioned your fuselage that you dragged across Wales from, not personally,
No, not personally.
but from Swansea via Ebervale to Llandudno. You took over a vast warehouse in the South Wales valleys to put on 150, the story of the Welsh settlement of Patagonia. You commandeered the whole of Larne to revisit the story of Under Milkwood. You clearly like a large canvas. Could you talk about, two things? One, how, why is it that you paint on such a large scale as an artist, and what are the particular difficulties, particularly in relation to working on staging something on the beach at Swansea and then moving into the Guildhall?
Road closures,
you don't make it easy for yourself.
No, but it's interesting how, because I surprised myself thinking, oh my God, this is enormous, and how did this actually happen? Because I used to make like really intimate kind of solo works, and suddenly, I think it was through National Theatre Wales, through John McGrath's, the director, former director, trust in me, and I created a piece in Barmouth called For Mountain, Sand and Sea, which looked at its kind of golden era during the war and how that affected and still has impact. And I worked with a group of artists to reinterpret that history, but also worked with the community, created a story shop, collated all these stories. And also for me, it was really crucial to work with the community and to have them engaged and have, it's their history that we were portraying. And it kind of grew. And for me, I love collaborating. I mean, when we did in Swansea, when the aeroplane nested there, I went with Owen saying, right, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to turn the former vetch ground into a garden. I said, okay, let's go to the council. We persuaded the council, we persuaded the locals. They were that
easy.
They were like, oh my God, and we want a community centre. And eventually, gradually, with, I think artists can achieve anything with a bit of passion and a bit of cheek and charm, of course, right? And a bit of tweed. And we then, and we persuaded, it was hard, it was tough, but we believed in it, and this is still there. And I took you there. Is an extraordinary.
It is an astonishing place.
Where it's totally transformative. And these people lived in sandfields. They didn't know each other. You've got the Chinese elders. You've got the Bangladeshi women. You've got the kind of the bigots, and they are they were there, right? And they're.
It was a community project in the sense that you encounter all kinds of political views and backgrounds. And what was great about this was we asked people if they wanted to come and participate in a project, and we started talking about a green space because the football field was in the centre of this very compact area of the city, lots of terrace housing, if you know it. And basically, they didn't have a space where they could look at somebody across a green space. And that's a lovely thing to be able to do, is look across a green space, And there's nothing there. So this was a really kind of psychologically a massive shift for the community. It happened to be the centenary thing of the Swans, which neither of us knew, obviously. And so we got a lot of tearful Swans fans turning up to mourn the loss of this football stadium. And somehow this project really gained momentum, and over 150 people garden there. It's a raised bed system, there's bees, there's beekeeping, there's chickens, there's all kinds of things still there. And, it's been an extraordinary life-changing project for both of us, really, isn't it? But it really was a huge influence on me. But I live in that square mile, so that for me it was really important to have this kind of contact with the community I live in. And I work internationally, but the idea of working locally to enable international work, I think that's a really key thing that we both feel, which is why you come back to Swansea a lot.
No, absolutely.
We must return to Guildhall, though.
Yes.
You are putting on this epic story with the connecting 3 eras of war in one building. How have you managed to create a kind of coherent narrative in your head in this on this vast stage?
I think 1489. I think it's got to be 3 years that you approached me, and I was like, once I was based, I kind of struck on the idea of the panels. I was like, oh, okay, of course we should do it in there, but of course we should use the beach. Of course the 3 narratives all will converge. Eddie will lead. She, as the peace protester, she will have a megaphone. She will declare the beginning Gwira Aeth Gytrath across the Swansea Bay to the people. She will guide the audience as though you're in a protest march. Kind of embodying the Greenham Common movement, the suffragettes, and bringing those women together to recite together. There is a surprise, which I'm not going to tell you, but the contemporary soldier will emerge and his platoon. They will storm the Brangwyn. You will then enter the Brangwyn to an installation that will hopefully take you right back to the kind of visceral, kind of the root of World War I, where you will then hear the Requiem, which will be beautiful, I'm sure, and also, but there will be a performative element. There will be, we're working with kind of young boys from the Swansea Valley area. So for me, there is a very strong community element. And then after the Requiem, you have 45, 50 minutes to look at different installations, scenes, reflections on war and peace, which will include 8 Tibetan monks creating a peace mandala, which is, perfect, because we begin on the beach. They are creating this amazing kind of healing, it's all about healing, kind of mandala, and on the last day, on the Sunday, the monks will scoop it up, take it back to the beach, and give it back to the sea. So that will be the final kind of healing kind of ritual. And I always forget about the monks, so it's kind of a really important part. And, you know, we're having also a kind of...
Can you forget 8 monks?
No, there's lots of elements.
It's a big piece, Kate.
But also there's within the council chamber, we will hold a peace conference with the local school kids based on the League of Nations. That will be recorded. Elements of that will be shown. There will be, there are so many elements. And at the end, you will then go outside to see the rotunda. There will be a wildflower planting in the colour palette of the panels, and then you will then be able to kind of drink soup for the finale, which will happen. So I'm not going to tell you.
There's far more than we can actually really encompass in the time available. I just want to ask you a quick question, Owen Roberts. What's the acoustic like in the? It's a vast hall.
It's a wonderful acoustic. It's really great. I mean, the special thing also about the hall is the organ, which I've not had the experience of playing an organ like that very often. We had a session with Johan there playing, and it's I think they said it came from Liverpool. Something about it was going to be destroyed, and they saved it and put it in the Brangwyn Hall, and it's got all these beautiful idiosyncrasies in it. Some of it's out of tune, but in a way that is just
interesting,
beautiful and interesting and perfect for, again, this clash between beauty and destruction that needs to be a part of the sound to support the themes, So. But yeah, you play a loud note that goes on forever in that space. It's wonderful. It's really good. The choir, I'm so excited to hear them in that space, I think.
Owen, before I ask you to read, can I just ask, you've got a play on at the Swan,
yes,
which is about the World War II poet Keith Douglas, Unicorns Almost. You mentioned Pink Mist. Mm-hmm. You haven't mentioned The Green Hollow, but that is your beautiful poem about Aberfan. You are drawn to stories of war and stories of grief. How does this, a Gododdin, fit in with that the narrative of your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that I'm sort of drawn to stories of war and conflict, because that is very much...
Forgot to mention Mamet's as well.
How it's been, yeah. In that it was never my intention to write so much about conflict. The shortest answer is that the post-9/11 conflicts have run almost exactly parallel with my writing life. And so even when writing historically, for me it's nearly always a prism through which to look at this fact that, as I said before, we're still doing it. And at times of conflict, at times of war, public narratives tend to become very blunt. They tend to be painted with very broad brushstrokes. And I've always felt that part of the job of the writer is to drill back to the human and to the intimate, and to try to keep the human details of what conflict is in front of people's faces as much as possible. I should say that my latest piece is to mark the 70th anniversary of the NHS. So I have finally moved away from war, thankfully, towards what I think is at the other end of the scale, is still our most radical and beautiful idea that we've ever made happen. And so hopefully I'm starting to put some stuff in the other side of the scales. But in terms of a Gododdin, I think, as I touched upon earlier, it has all of those elements. It has the mythic and the communal lamentation come celebration, but all the way through, even if these are very cursory introductions, it's about these individuals. It's about these individuals, and the names that they are given suggest characters and suggest lives and suggest what they did. There's in the second stanza that I'll read, it talks about how he was at his most fierce when he was fighting to save the War Brothers or the family's herb garden, which kind of links back to everything that you're doing there. And so it's a piece for me which has these suggestions of these untold stories, and all the stories that are lost in every conflict and that are being lost in conflicts now, primarily amongst civilians. I mean, and that's something else that we should say. And it does what the ancient texts, which last, does so well, that it feels incredibly relevant to now, and yet also as if it comes to us with a very ancient wisdom as well.
Could we hear your version, please?
Sure. I'll stand at the lectern for this. So Jasper called this a version, which is very much what it is, and we've heard from the stage people talking about voices combining voices and the concept of grafting, and that's very much how I sort of see this little short piece. It's grafting of my voice with a 6th century poet, or maybe poets, who knows, and hopefully a channeling of voices too. And I suppose one of the joys of writing in this way as a writer is that it allows you to write in a way that you never would otherwise. He moved like a horse, that hero of the grey forehead, a flame most alight when his spears were swift. Now he is slain, a gift of a feast for a crow. As they left him, that man of an eagle's grace, the fords spray like dew on his upturned face. The poets of the world weighed his heart in his breast, washed as it was with the blood of others and his own. This one was the wolf of the host, most elated when defending their earth, his war brother's garden of herbs, a slayer among the blood-stained blades, a champion crimsoned in fury until they speared his eyes away. A song was snatched from this host, taken from our sons in the soil, their blood-stained wool stamped out like the trees of the wood, trampled by war's terrible fury. With corpses this song is composed, their communion cup, death's trophy. A song was born of this host, a crescendo of fire, thunder and flood. This one longed for the battle and the blood, rushing to fight in the wood, putting his shoulder to the shield and his hand to the blade, as if they were glasses of golden mead, alive with jewels of threaded beads. 300 golden men as one for their nation. Of all who went, only one would remain. 300 golden men, a blood pulse flowing on. 300 armed as one, on 300 steeds of passion. 3 captains and 300. Alas, only one will return, only one. He who sings this song. Like a fire taking when kindled, and glowing to flame when blown, the stewards could not contain their clamour to become the land of broken men. On Tuesday they donned their fine webbing. On Wednesday their desires were swelling. On Thursday their envoy sent packing. On Friday their carnage was planning. On Saturday they went in a quickening. On Sunday the blades came beckoning. On Monday the blood was thigh flowing. A pity it is, after toil, to see the suffering of our fresh men falling headlong in the field. A long sigh our lamentation, a long sigh for the broken men, the boys once golden, now crimson. Thank you.
That was wonderful. We're now going to see a 3-minute trailer for Now the Hero, Nawr or Arwr. So, how do we cue that up?
Yeah, Sam, if you could play it, that would be great.
Life in the trenches was nightmarish. Aside from the usual rigours of combat, forces of nature posed as great a threat as the opposing army. Heavy rainfall flooded trenches and created impassable, muddy conditions. The mud not only made it difficult to get from one place to another, it also had other, more dire consequences. Many times, soldiers became trapped in the thick, deep mud, unable to extricate themselves due to fatigue. They often drowned, and the saturated ground swallowed them.
well, and we hope your appetite is whetted. We have just over 10 minutes for some questions. So if anyone would like to ask any of the panel anything about either Now the Hero or indeed the rest of their careers, then please speak up. Yes, over there. Oh, sorry, down there.
Well, it's it's certainly whetted my appetite, and I'd love to come, but it's a very short run. Is that, it just feels like four days? And
it's 5 nights. Actually.
5 nights, but it just happens to be at a time of the year when I may not be able to go. But I take it that's that, is it?
It is,
obviously very site-specific.
If you can imagine, it's because it's so specific, and also using the whole of the Brangwyn is kind of you can't have it for a long period of time. But we will be documenting it. We will it will be there'll be an archive which will go online. So hopefully you will have an opportunity to see it on digitally online. Unfortunately,
Okay.
I mean that
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And could I just ask where the choir come from? Because you mentioned the
It's
choir.
Polyphony. They're from London. They're originally, they're all over London.
Yeah, and Stephen Layton's from in Trinity College, Cambridge.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, over there.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm interested in the gardens aspect. It seems that the 6th century, there's the reference to the herb garden. If you think of modern warfare, it's often about migrants creating small community gardens to reflect the past and present that they have now lost. The First World War seems to me to be different. It seems to be about grand memorialisation, if you think about the Lutyens' gardens of remembrance and the mass agriculture, the dig for victory aspects. And I just wondered whether you incorporated or reconciled any of those 3 different approaches.
Well, the garden, first and foremost, is a tool rather than a kind of commemorative work, really. It's really more of a kind of how we can talk about these issues in a kind of through making and through bringing communities together. We're working with quite a wide group of people in the garden, and we've been talking about bringing somebody called Professor George Mackay, who's written a great book called Radical Gardening, to talk about those exact histories, actually. So what we'd like to do in the syllabus of the garden, in this soil-based syllabus, it's called Graft, and then has an undertitle, a soil-based syllabus, is that we would bring some of those talks into the garden and actually create kind of more of a kind of public lecture series around some of these ideas. So literally exploring the kind of radical nature of these gardens, but also connecting it to the Dig for Victory and all the land army and all those kinds of connections, and also to things like the Ebenezer Howard kind of ideas of the Garden City and the Utopia, and because Brangwyn's connection to William Morris. It's quite clear. So we thought that there's lots of ways in there, not just to talk to community groups, but also talking to school groups about these ideas as well. So I think that this is a kind of radical space, even though it's in an institution, and it has the possibility to be this kind of arena for all these kinds of conversations. So I think we're doing it in subtle ways. We're doing it through creating spaces for people to make things and have conversations, but we're also doing it in this kind of more formal educational way as well. Come along.
Yes. Thank you, Owen. There's a question here. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. It was amazing. The love you've got for the project, it just comes from all of you. It's incredible. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned collapsing time. I just wondered, what do you mean, and how did you do that? If you could just tell me a bit more about that.
I mean, it's simply putting different histories together. For example, if you have, I wouldn't say that, I was going to give it away. So you're going to have they're going to be present, 3 soldiers from 3 different areas. They will be together in one room, doing an action together. So you saw the kind of Celtic warrior, the World War I soldier, the contemporary soldier. They'll have their own narrative running through the whole piece, but sometimes they'll be doing things together. So that's what I mean by collapsing time. And I did it in a lot of my work. For example, in the Barmouth show, you had a World War I soldier kind of dancing with a woman who was, a woman who remembered her past, her lost lover. So it's putting those two things together and creating kind of a quite a powerful kind of emotional moment. And I think collapsing time is a really strong device to kind of to achieve that and to make something really kind of impactful.
Yes, oh, someone over there.
No, I just thought there's one word that encompasses the whole project, and the land army, the army growing the food, and the word is survival. Would you agree?
Yes, I think yes, absolutely, and it's also it's about healing. I mean, I keep on returning to the word healing, and it's survival through healing. I mean, you have to heal. I mean, it's about, as Owen, the Gododdin is written in 600 AD. We haven't learned from that. We are still doing it. So I think Brangwyn's vision, perhaps that's what a healed world looks like. That's what survival looks like, and we've got to work together. That represents people constructing, growing, harvesting. It's exactly what Owen Griffiths is doing with these people, and that's how we can survive, and we must not do it again. So yeah, that's my answer.
Pretty strong.
Anybody else answer that?
I wanted to ask you another question, Mark, which is the remarkable trenches that seem to be by the Welsh rocky cliff tops.
Well, yeah,
where are they and what are they?
They are former World War I practice trenches outside. It's in Pen Alley outside Tenby. And what I love about them is that they're overgrown, and it looks like an ancient earthwork. And then when you see Eddie, kind of like a little ant moving around, and it's the perfect place. And the fact that they are overgrown, and you've got this landscape, and they will feature as a motif throughout the whole piece as a kind of pattern, or it will appear. So, and I like the fact that she's kind of dominating this landscape as this powerful woman. She's almost a kind of giant, and kind of appropriating the land once again.
Is there going to be any Welsh spoken in it at all?
Of course, the six. Well,
apart from a Gododdin.
Well, only there's no. I mean, it's a visual experience. It's an immersive experience. Yeah. It's a visceral visual experience. So apart from the libretto and apart from the poem, the Cydadrodd, and there'll be a wedding party. There might be saying something. Maybe there'll be a few surprises as well. No, but I think that's it. I think, yeah.
Do we have some more questions? Yes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I just feel like from whether it's gardening on a rooftop or in parking lots or whatever, urban gardening seems to be having a real moment at the moment. And I wondered whether you felt that came from a place of kind of food resilience and kind of from quite a futuristic perspective, or maybe there's the nostalgia attached to it from, just Britishness and digging for victory and all of that kind of thing. I just wondered where you felt the narratives were around why it's having a moment.
Yeah, I think we've probably all seen images of, Detroit and the kind of reclaimed industrial landscapes, and how these edible projects are really kind of flying the flag for these kinds of resistance movements, as well as conversations around neoliberalism, gentrification, and the landscapes of politics that are dominating our urban city centres. But I think also it comes from a sense of needing mechanisms of reconnection. I think the main thing in the gardens that I've made, this is the third in an archipelago of gardens, one with Isabel at a prison for 12 to 16-year-old kids in Neath, and hopefully one in a farm next year sometime. And I think these spaces have a kind of possibility to have a kind of anti-capitalist conversation. So in the city centre, when you think about the kind of urban development plans, these fly-through things that are presented by urban developers, and every city centre looks the same. It's all white people shopping, and nobody doing anything that's not about consuming or paying for something. So these spaces, for me, are kind of deeply political spaces, and that doesn't mean that they're not problematic spaces and that they're not exclusive spaces. In Berlin, in cities all around Europe, you see these incredible rooftop gardens, parking lots being taken over. And this, starts really with Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers. in I don't know, I can't remember the date now, a splinter group from the English Civil War, that starts with that radicalism, and we've just sort of disconnected, I think, from land use and from food. And I think, schools and all these kind of developments desperately need to talk about our urban landscapes in the context of like, how will they be, how are we talking about food production, how are we talking about sustainability, and how can we talk about community in these spaces? So for me, there are opportunities to do that. So yeah, it's at a very current conversation in the kind of how we talk about city centres, but I think that's really, really exciting. And it's really great that when you think about Wales, right, Wales, a small country, post-Brexit, we have this opportunity now to talk about, I'm getting on my soapbox now, but you can get the opportunity to really talk about how we could talk about urban design, how we could talk about city centres, how we could develop food strategies, educational strategies that are about reconnecting communities with their sources of food and creating spaces where people feel welcome, people feel equal, spaces of equity. And that's what's important, and I think that's what I'm trying to do with the garden. And we're not there yet. We're still building the thing, and we're also trying to make a space where things slow down. I think that's really nice as well. These urban gardens are spaces for slow processes amongst these extremely busy and extremely capitalist zones. So how can we make a space for slowness? So I think that's what creativity and art offers, isn't it? Is a kind of a space for a slowness, to just look at something or just talk to someone and look at a potato or whatever it is. Dig the land, So yeah, it's got utopian and hippie and connotations and all that, but we need that now.
We've got to stop any minute, but I've got three very quick questions. One for Owen Roberts. What's it like composing in the Welsh language, composing music to be?
Well, I've only got the one line in Welsh to deal with.
Okay, but
it is the chorus.
But it is the key line, and it's the most incredible language for singers. I mean, these were English singers who we were working with, who none of them spoke any Welsh, I don't think. Marc helped them out a little bit, and it's the most powerful sound to work with singers, I think.
Marc, how's the Swansea Valley female choir recruitment going?
Good. I mean, we're still looking for women, and we've got a representation here. My sister, her friend Jane, and they're incredible because
my mother's.
Oh yes, as well. So we've got a smattering, and it's great because Eddie goes in and teaches them and guides them, and they meet once a month, and it's fantastic. Yeah. And it's only 6 verses, but it's extraordinarily difficult. And Eddie, being Eddie, it's so passionate, is guiding them through. Because I want 100 women, it's going to sound extraordinary.
Final question for you, Owen. What are you going to be signing afterwards?
I'll sign anything.
Really?
Steady. I think the festival has some of the very first copies of the NHS film poem that I was talking about to provide all people.
Which is going to be on BBC Two when?
BBC Two on June the 30th.
Right. That's another date for your diary. I should just finish by saying that Marc Rees today has been created Professor of Practice at the University of Wales. And congratulations to you. Owen is already Professor of Creativity at the University of Swansea, so we had 3 caps, 2 professors.
We're too young.
Exactly. You'll get there.
And 2 Reeses. So to the 3 Owens and Marc, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.